Losing everything in the city, my apartment, my career, my fiancé, my dignity was, without a shadow of a doubt, the single best thing that ever happened to me. I know how that sounds. I know you're thinking, sure, honey, tell yourself that. But stay with me, because by the end of this story, you're going to understand exactly why I mean it, word for word. Good day, listeners. It's Maggie Sullivan here. Everybody calls me Maggie, and I'm 42 years old. Before I continue, please like this video and subscribe and leave me a comment, because I read every single one of them, and today's story is one you're not going to forget. 3 years ago, I was standing in the marble lobby of a building I helped design, wearing a blazer I couldn't afford, watching security escort me out like I was a criminal. My own name wasn't even on the awards they handed out that night. That name belonged to my fiancé, Derek Kingston. Derek Kingston, golden boy of Kingston and Associates, the man I had built an entire architecture firm's reputation on the back of, quietly, invisibly, for 6 years. I met Derek when I was 29, fresh out of grad school, drowning in student debt, hungry to prove myself in a city that eats hungry women alive. He was charming. He was magnetic. He made me feel like the smartest person in every room right up until the moment he started taking my sketches into meetings and presenting them as his own. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. We were a team. What was his was mine, and what was mine was his. That's what he always said, usually right after he'd walked out of a client pitch with my blueprints under his arm and my ideas coming out of his mouth. I believed him because I loved him, and because love makes you an excellent liar to yourself. The Ashford Tower project was the one that broke me. I designed that building over 8 months, the cantilevered glass atrium, the vertical gardens, the whole sustainable concept that got us featured in 3 national magazines. I didn't sleep for weeks. I skipped my own cousin's wedding to finish the renderings. And when the ribbon-cutting ceremony happened, when the mayor shook hands and the cameras flashed, Derek stood at the podium and said, "This has been my vision since day one. Mine. My vision. My name should have been on that podium." I confronted him that night in our kitchen, the kitchen in the apartment I paid half the rent on in the building where my name wasn't even on the lease, because Derek said it was cleaner that way. I asked him how he could stand there and let the world believe a lie. He looked at me the way you look at a mildly annoying employee. "Maggie, be realistic," he said. "Clients don't want to hire the woman behind the man. They want the man. That's just how this industry works. You should be thanking me for making the firm successful enough to keep employing you." Employing me? After 6 years of engagement, after everything I had poured into that firm and into him, I was suddenly an employee who should be grateful. I should have walked out that night. God, I wish I had. Instead, I made the mistake of trying to fight for what was mine. I went to the firm's board directly. I brought printouts of my original sketches, dated and time-stamped, proof that the Ashford Tower concept was mine from the very first pencil line. I thought I was being smart. I thought evidence would matter. What I didn't know was that Derek had already gotten there first. He told the board I was emotionally unstable, that I'd been struggling with the pressure, that I was trying to sabotage the firm's biggest win out of some kind of jealous breakdown because our engagement was falling apart. He even produced messages I'd sent him venting after a hard day, cherry-picked and stripped of context, to paint me as unhinged. The board believed him. Of course they did. He was the face of the company. I was the woman crying in a conference room, which conveniently is exactly the picture he'd already painted of me. Within a week, I was fired. Within 2, Derek had quietly made calls to every major firm in the city, warning them I was difficult, unstable, someone who makes accusations when she doesn't get her way. I found out later he actually used those words, almost verbatim, to at least 4 different firms. I know this because one of the hiring managers, a woman named Priya who I'd worked with years earlier, called me privately to warn me. "Maggie," she said, "I don't know what happened between you two, but he's poisoned the well. Nobody in this city is going to touch your resume right now. I want to pause here and tell you about the smaller cruelties too, listeners, because it's never just the one big betrayal that breaks a person. It's the 100 small ones leading up to it." It was Derek forgetting to invite me to industry dinners where he'd network on the strength of projects I'd designed. It was him introducing me at parties as my partner, she dabbles in design, while he told investors he'd trained under some famous European architect who, as far as I could ever tell, didn't actually exist. It was him borrowing $5,000 from my savings for a client dinner that turned out to be a solo trip to Miami with a colleague named Whitney, who I later learned wasn't just a colleague. Every single one of those moments I forgave. I told myself relationships require patience. I told myself he was under pressure. I told myself 100 different lies dressed up as loyalty, because the alternative, admitting the man I'd built my entire adult life around was quietly, methodically hollowing me out, was too enormous to face all at once. I lost my job. I lost my reputation. And 3 weeks later, standing in the lobby of Ashford Tower, the building I designed for a meeting I'd begged for just to plead my case one more time, Derek had me escorted out by security while his new assistant, some 24-year-old in 6-inch heels, smirked at me from behind the front desk like I was a piece of gum stuck to the marble floor. "You're embarrassing yourself, Maggie," Derek said, loud enough for the whole lobby to hear. "Go home. Go back to whatever little town you came from. This life was never really yours to keep." That sentence followed me for a long time. This life was never really yours to keep. I had $1,100 in my checking account. My name wasn't on the lease, so I had 30 days to get out of the apartment I'd lived in for 4 years. My credit was wrecked from covering expenses Derek promised to pay back and never did. My professional network had gone silent overnight, like I'd developed a contagious disease. I packed exactly 1 suitcase, because that's all I had left that was truly, unquestionably mine, and I bought a one-way bus ticket back to Cedar Hollow, the small town I'd sworn at 18 I would never, ever return to. You have to understand what Cedar Hollow meant to me. It was the place I ran from. Population under 4,000, one blinking traffic light, a town where everybody's business is everybody else's business by breakfast. I left at 18 with a scholarship and a promise to myself that I would become someone the city respected, someone who mattered. And now, here I was, 39 years old, dragging 1 suitcase down Main Street, going home in complete defeat. Exactly the way every gossiping voice back there always predicted I would. "Well, would you look at that?" said Verna Higgins, the owner of the general store, the second I stepped off the bus. She said it to no one in particular, but loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Little Maggie Sullivan, back from the big city. Guess it didn't work out so shiny after all." I smiled at her. Tight, practiced, the kind of smile you learn in a city full of people who'd stab you for a promotion. "Good to see you too, Verna," I said, and kept walking. The judgment followed me everywhere that first week. At the diner, at the post office, at my own grandmother's funeral reception 2 years earlier, if I'm honest. People had already started that whisper campaign. Poor Maggie, so career-obsessed. No husband, no children. Probably why that engagement fell apart. Now that the engagement really had fallen apart, and spectacularly, they had all the confirmation they needed. But grief and humiliation do something strange to a person. They either crush you completely, or they burn every ounce of softness out of you and leave something harder and clearer behind. For me, it was the second one. Somewhere between that bus ride and that first cruel comment from Verna Higgins, something in me went cold and still, like a lake freezing over. I decided right there on Main Street that I was done being anyone's punchline. My grandmother had left me one thing when she passed: Hollow Creek Farm, 72 acres of overgrown pasture, a collapsing barn, and a farmhouse with a roof that leaked in 4 different places. Nobody in the family wanted it. My cousins had already tried to talk me into selling it for scrap value to a developer who wanted to bulldoze it for a strip mall. I'd always said no, mostly out of sentiment. Now, sitting on that ruined porch with 1 suitcase and $1,100 to my name, that same worthless piece of land was the only thing standing between me and total ruin, or the only real chance I had left. I remember sitting on those porch steps at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep, staring out at the dark shapes of the barn and the tree line beyond it, and something clicked into place. I was an architect. I understood space, structure, story, and vision better than almost anyone Derek had ever hired. I had spent 6 years building someone else's empire with my bare hands and my sleepless nights. What if, for once, I built my own? I didn't have money. I didn't have credit. What I had was a design portfolio nobody in the city would touch anymore. 72 acres of neglected land, and an anger so clean and so focused it felt like rocket fuel. I started small. I sold my engagement ring, the one Derek proposed with, the one that used to make me feel like the luckiest woman alive and now just felt like a shackle, for $4,000 to a pawn shop 2 towns over, so nobody local would see and start talking. I used that money to patch the barn roof myself, watching online tutorials at night by flashlight because I couldn't afford new batteries for anything nicer. I mucked out stalls, I pulled weeds until my hands blistered and then calused. I drew up plans on butcher paper because I couldn't afford proper drafting supplies, plans for what this land could become. Not a strip mall, not a bulldozed memory, a destination. I wanted to turn Hollow Creek Farm into a high-end countryside retreat, the kind of place burned-out city people would pay real money to disappear into restored farmhouse suites. A converted barn as an event space for weddings. Walking trails through the woods my grandmother used to take me on as a kid. Local, organic food sourced from neighboring farms who'd been getting squeezed out by big grocery chains for years. I wanted to build something that didn't just serve me. I wanted it to lift the whole town up with it. Of course, when I pitched this idea to the one and only bank in Cedar Hollow, the loan officer, a nervous man named Gary who'd known me since I was in pigtails, looked at me like I'd proposed opening a casino in the church basement. "Maggie, sweetheart," he said, "no offense, but the last thing this town needs is another failed dream. You sure you don't just want something simpler? A little bakery, maybe?" I did not want a little bakery. I got turned down by that bank, and then by the regional bank in the next county, and then by an online small business lender who took one look at my recent credit history, wrecked by Derek's unpaid debts, and rejected me in 4 minutes flat. Every closed door felt like Derek's voice again. This life was never really yours to keep, but every time I heard it, I just worked harder, because spite, it turns out, is an incredibly reliable source of energy when you have nothing else left. There were nights during those first few months when I genuinely wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake coming back here at all. I remember one storm in particular, sometime in early spring, when half the barn roof I'd just patched blew clean off in the wind, and I stood out there at midnight in a poncho, screaming into the rain like a madwoman because I had exactly $230 left to my name and a roof that apparently hated me personally. I called my cousin Delia that night, sobbing, asking her if she thought I was crazy for trying this. Delia, bless her, didn't sugarcoat anything. "Maggie," she said, "you've spent your whole life letting other people decide whether your ideas were good enough. Derek decided. The board decided. Even Mom and Dad decided, God rest them, when they told you architecture was a man's field. I don't know if this resort thing is crazy or brilliant, but I know it's the first time in your whole life you decided something for yourself. Don't you dare quit now just because it's raining." I didn't quit. I bought a tarp with the last of that $230, climbed back up in the wind, and secured it myself, because there was nobody else coming to do it for me, and for the first time in years, that felt less like abandonment and more like freedom. The town's judgment didn't stop either, not for a long while. There was a particularly memorable town council meeting, maybe 5 months into the rebuild, where a developer named Chip Denny, a man who'd been trying to buy up cheap farmland across the valley for years to build discount vacation cabins, stood up and publicly questioned whether some woman with a butcher paper business plan and no capital should even be allowed to pursue commercial zoning on Hollow Creek land. He said it looking directly at me, smug as anything, clearly expecting me to shrink the way I used to shrink in board meetings back in the city. I didn't shrink. I stood up, thanked the council for their time, and calmly walked them through the actual engineering specifications of my drainage plan, the environmental impact assessment I'd paid a friend of a friend engineer to review for cost, and the economic projections showing how many local jobs the project would create in its first 2 years alone. Numbers, incidentally, that dwarfed anything Chip Denny's discount cabin proposal had ever promised. The zoning board approved my permit unanimously that same night. Chip Denny didn't speak to me again for over a year, not until he needed a wedding venue for his daughter and, red-faced, had to book one of my barns anyway, because by then it was the only decent one in 3 counties. It was around this time, 9 months into rebuilding that barn practically brick by brick with my own hands and borrowed tools, that I met Nathaniel Hayes. Nathaniel was the only real success story Cedar Hollow had produced in a generation. He'd grown up 2 farms over from mine, gone off to study civil engineering, and instead of staying in some big city, he'd come home and quietly built a small empire of his own, restoring old buildings across 3 counties, developing sustainable housing, revitalizing a dying strip of Main Street storefronts that everyone had written off as hopeless. People respected him. People also, frankly, were a little intimidated by him because, unlike most folks in town, he didn't care one bit about gossip. He showed up at Hollow Creek Farm on a Tuesday afternoon, uninvited, in mud-caked boots and a truck that had clearly seen better decades. I was up on a ladder at the time, trying to reattach a section of barn siding that kept slipping, cursing at it in language my grandmother would not have approved of. "You're doing that wrong," he called up to me. "I'm doing plenty of things wrong today, so you'll have to be specific," I called back without looking down. He laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and climbed the ladder beside mine to show me how the bracket was supposed to sit. We got the siding fixed in 15 minutes flat, working in near silence, and by the time we were done, I'd learned 3 things about Nathaniel Hayes. 1. He didn't talk just to fill silence. 2. He noticed everything: the drainage problem near the east pasture, the fact that my roofline could support solar paneling, the way I flinched slightly whenever a car passed on the road, like I half expected it to be someone come to take even this from me. And 3, he wasn't the least bit interested in whatever story the town had already decided about me. "I heard you're turning this place into some kind of resort," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Word travels fast. It's a small town. Word's the only industry we've got." He looked out at the barn, the pasture, the tree line beyond it, the way I'd learned to look at raw land after 6 years of doing exactly that for a living, seeing not what it was, but what it could become. "It's a good idea," he said finally. "Better than good, actually. This valley's been dying slowly for 20 years because nobody with any real vision ever stuck around long enough to fix it. Most people just want to sell out to developers who will pave it flat and put up cookie-cutter housing. You're the first person in a long time who wants to build something that actually respects what's already here." Nobody had said anything like that to me in years. Not Derek, not the board, not one single soul in this city who'd spent 6 years watching me hand over my ideas for free. "The banks don't agree with you," I admitted. "Banks are cowards," Nathaniel said simply. "They fund what already worked yesterday. They never fund what's going to work tomorrow. That's why I stopped asking them for anything a long time ago." He didn't offer me money that day. What he offered me was better, a partnership. He had capital from his own developments. He had relationships with contractors and suppliers across 3 counties. And he had, more importantly, actual credibility with people who might otherwise laugh a woman with a butcher paper business plan right out of the room. In exchange, I brought him something he didn't have: real design vision. An architect's eye trained in a city that built million-dollar towers, and the kind of relentless, obsessive drive that comes from a woman who has absolutely nothing left to lose. "I'll match whatever you put in, dollar for dollar," he told me. "But I want to be clear about something, Maggie. I'm not doing this to rescue you. I don't think you need rescuing. I'm doing this because I think you're about to build something remarkable, and I don't want to miss my chance to be part of it." Nobody had trusted me with anything of consequence since the moment my name disappeared off my own designs. I said yes before he'd even finished his sentence. That's not to say it was easy after that either. Money got tight more than once, even with Nathaniel's backing. 6 weeks into the barn renovation, our contractor discovered rot in the main support beams that hadn't shown up in the initial inspection, which meant another $20,000 we hadn't budgeted for. I remember sitting at my grandmother's old kitchen table with Nathaniel at 11 at night, both of us staring at spreadsheets, trying to figure out where that money was going to come from without pulling out of the project entirely. "We could scale back," Nathaniel said. "Smaller event space, fewer suites to start." "No," I said, and I surprised myself with how fast the answer came. I spent 6 years building someone else's vision on a budget of nothing but my own exhaustion. I'm not doing that again. If we're building this, we build it right, or we don't build it at all. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, then we find the 20,000. And we did. Nathaniel liquidated a small rental property he'd been sitting on for years, and I took on freelance architectural consulting work for 2 neighboring counties, quietly under a new business name, just to keep cash flowing while the real project took shape. I hadn't touched a drafting program in 8 months, and it felt like breathing again the first time I opened one. No Derek looking over my shoulder. No board waiting to strip my name off the file. Word of what we were building started to spread locally long before any magazine ever wrote about it. The lumberyard owner 2 towns over, a gruff man named Boyd who'd known my grandfather, started giving us first pick on reclaimed barnwood before it even hit his regular inventory. "Because your granddad always paid his tab on time, and I got a feeling you're cut from the same cloth." The Hendersons, who ran the dairy farm bordering our east pasture, agreed to supply all our restaurants cream and cheese at a fair contract rate, which meant they didn't have to keep selling at a loss to the regional co-op that had been squeezing small farms dry for a decade. Slowly, without either of us really planning it that way, Hollow Creek Reserve stopped being just my project and started becoming something the whole valley had a stake in. What followed was 14 months of the hardest, most exhilarating work of my entire life. We didn't just rebuild the barn, we transformed it into a soaring event space with exposed timber beams and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the creek. We restored the farmhouse into 5 boutique suites, each one designed around a different wildflower that grew naturally on the property, with clawfoot tubs and reclaimed wood floors and views that made city people weep audibly, according to our first guest reviews. We built walking trails. We partnered with 6 neighboring farms to source everything from eggs to honey to lavender for the spa treatments, which meant every dollar spent at Hollow Creek Farm rippled straight back out into the pockets of my actual neighbors, the same neighbors who'd once whispered about my failure on Main Street. I named it Hollow Creek Reserve, and I designed every single inch of it myself, my name on every blueprint this time, no exceptions, no compromises. Verna Higgins was one of our first guests, if you can believe it. Not paying, mind you. We invited the whole town to a soft launch open house, and she stood in the middle of that restored barn with her jaw practically on the floor. "Maggie Sullivan," she said, "I don't think I've ever been more wrong about anybody in my whole life. It happens to the best of us, Verna," I said, and for the first time since Derek's voice had echoed in my head on that porch step, I actually meant the forgiveness in it. Word spread faster than I could have dreamed. A regional lifestyle magazine did a feature on us within the first 6 months, the architect who rebuilt her life, one barn at a time, and after that the bookings didn't stop. Within a year, Hollow Creek Reserve was fully booked 8 months in advance. Within 18 months, we were named one of the top 20 boutique retreats in the entire country by a major travel outlet, and Nathaniel and I were fielding calls from investors wanting to help us expand into 2 more properties across the county. I want to be honest with you about something, listeners, because I promised at the start of this channel I would always tell you the truth, even the parts that don't fit neatly into a fairy tale. Nathaniel and I did fall for each other, somewhere between fixing that barn siding and watching our first guests walk down the aisle in a wedding venue we'd built from nothing. But that isn't really the heart of this story. The heart of this story is that for the first time since I was 29 years old, I built something that was completely, unquestionably, undeniably mine. Nobody could take my name off this blueprint. I made sure of that. Which brings me to the part of this story you're probably waiting for. 2 years after that bus ride down Main Street, we hosted the Hollow Creek Harvest Festival, our biggest event yet, a full weekend celebration marking our official expansion announcement, with national travel journalists flown in, a segment crew from a major morning show, the county mayor, half the town, and more press credentials floating around that farmyard than I'd ever seen in 6 years working in the city. It was, by every measure, the crowning achievement of everything I had rebuilt from absolutely nothing. I was standing near the barn entrance in a cream linen dress, going over final logistics with our events coordinator, when I heard a voice behind me that made my entire spine turn to ice. "Well," Derek Kingston said, "would you look at this? Little Maggie Sullivan struck gold." I turned around slowly. He looked older than I remembered. A little softer around the middle. His once perfect suit, clearly a size too tight now, like he'd been squeezing into an image of himself that no longer quite fit. Beside him stood 2 men in dark suits carrying leather portfolios, the unmistakable posture of lawyers who bill by the hour and enjoy it. "Derek," I said, "and I want you to know, listeners, my voice did not shake even 1 single degree. Not one. This is private property. You weren't invited." "I read about your little project in the paper," he said, ignoring me completely, looking around at the crowd, the cameras, the sheer scale of what I'd built. Impressive, actually. Didn't know you had it in you without me holding your hand the whole way. "I never needed your hand," I said. "I needed my name back, which, as I recall, you took." His smile flickered, just slightly. "That's actually why I'm here, Maggie. See, my firm's had a rough couple years. Some cash flow issues, a couple of lawsuits that didn't go my way, nothing I can't recover from with the right partnership, and I started thinking, this land, this whole operation, it's built on Sullivan family property, isn't it? Your grandmother's land." I did some digging. There's an old easement dispute from decades back that was never properly resolved. My legal team here believes there's a very strong case that a portion of this property doesn't actually belong to you free and clear. I felt Nathaniel's presence beside me before I even turned my head. He'd walked over the moment he clocked the suits, the way he always seemed to know exactly when something needed backup, without ever crowding me out of handling it myself. "You flew lawyers out here," I said slowly, "to a harvest festival, in front of national media, to try to steal my grandmother's land." "I prefer to call it correcting an oversight," Derek said, and one of his lawyers actually had the audacity to hand a folder to a nearby reporter, like he'd pre-planned this entire ambush for maximum public embarrassment. "There's also the matter of some, let's say, questionable business practices we've uncovered, unlicensed contractors, zoning irregularities. It would be a shame if all this—" He gestured broadly at the barn, the crowd, the string lights glowing gold in the early evening air, turned out to be built on a foundation of fraud. "Wouldn't want the national press catching wind of a scam right as they're writing their glowing little features." There was a ripple through the crowd. Cameras turning, reporters leaning in, sensing blood in the water, exactly the kind of dramatic pivot that makes for a viral headline. One of the lawyers, a tall man with slicked back hair, actually pulled out his phone and started filming me, presumably to capture whatever panicked reaction he assumed was coming. A woman from the morning show crew leaned toward her producer and whispered something I couldn't hear, but I didn't need to hear it to know exactly what kind of segment they thought they were about to get. Small-town fraud, exposed at her own festival, right on schedule for the evening news cycle. A year ago, even 6 months ago, this might have terrified me. I know exactly what the old version of me would have done. She would have gone quiet. She would have pulled Nathaniel aside privately, tried to smooth it over, tried to protect the festival's reputation by making the confrontation disappear rather than confronting it head-on, because that old version of me had spent 6 years believing that keeping the peace mattered more than being right. Derek had trained me well in that particular lesson, and it had cost me everything. Standing there that evening, watching Derek Kingston try one more time to take something that belonged to me, all I felt was a strange, quiet calm, because I had learned something in those 2 years he clearly hadn't counted on. I had learned to protect myself before anyone ever tried to hurt me again. Priya's phone call 8 months earlier hadn't been an accident I stumbled into. The moment I heard Derek's firm was struggling, I'd asked her to keep digging quietly, methodically, because some deep, hard-won instinct in me knew that a man like Derek Kingston doesn't simply disappear from your life. Men like that circle back when they smell success. I'd spent 8 months preparing for exactly this moment, hoping I'd never need it, and building it anyway because hope is not a strategy. "Funny you should mention fraud," I said, loud enough for the gathering crowd and every single camera to hear clearly, "because I actually have something to show everyone tonight." I was going to save it for the after-dinner program, but since you're here, Derek, let's do it now. I nodded to our events coordinator, who signaled the AV crew we'd hired for the festival's big screen presentation, the one meant to showcase our expansion renderings to investors and press. The massive display beside the barn flickered to life. "About 8 months ago," I said, walking toward the small stage we'd set up for festival announcements, my voice carrying clean and steady across the crowd, "I got a call from a woman named Priya Anand. Some of you might recognize that name. She used to work with me back in the city, and she's since become a forensic financial consultant. She reached out because she'd heard through old industry contacts that my former fiancé's firm was quietly shopping around for emergency investors. Struggling, apparently, despite years of taking credit for work that wasn't his." Derek's face had gone very still. "Curious, I asked her to look into it further," I continued, and the first document appeared on the big screen behind me, a financial filing, clearly labeled, clearly dated. What she found was that Kingston & Associates has been operating at a significant loss for the past 3 years. Multiple unpaid vendor lawsuits, a tax lien from the state, and, most interesting of all, a second document appeared, this one with a section highlighted in bright red, an attempt just 2 months ago to forge a signature on a property transfer document using a deceased notary's stamp in a failed attempt to seize collateral from a different former business partner who'd also had the misfortune of trusting Derek Kingston with something valuable. Gasps rippled through the crowd. One of the national reporters was already typing furiously on her phone. Derek's 2 lawyers had gone pale and were whispering urgently to each other. "That's fabricated," Derek said, his voice rising, cracking slightly at the edges. "This is a smear campaign. These are public county filings and matters of public record, Derek," I said calmly. "Anyone can verify them. I'd encourage every journalist here tonight to do exactly that before you run home and write your stories, because I have copies for every single one of you." Our coordinator, right on cue, began quietly distributing printed packets to the press. As for the easement claim on my grandmother's land, that dispute was resolved and legally recorded in 1987, 39 years ago, and the documentation is also in that packet. Derek didn't do any digging. He hoped I'd panic in front of cameras before anyone bothered to check. The mayor, standing near the front of the crowd, had already pulled out his own phone, clearly making a call to the county clerk or the sheriff or both. I honestly didn't care which. Nathaniel stepped up beside me on the small stage, not to speak, not to save me, just to stand there, solid and steady, letting the whole town see exactly whose side he was on without saying a single word. "You want to talk about scams?" I said, turning back to Derek. And for the first time in this entire confrontation, I let every ounce of the last 6 years show plainly on my face. Let's talk about the man who took my architectural designs, presented them as his own, called me unstable to a room full of executives to cover his own theft, and had me escorted out of a lobby by security in front of strangers because I dared to ask for credit for my own work. Let's talk about the man who left me with $1,100 and a wrecked credit score and told me this life was never really mine to keep. My voice didn't shake. Not once. "You were wrong, Derek. This life was always mine. You were just borrowing it, and I finally took it back." The crowd had gone completely silent, save for the click and whir of camera shutters. One of Derek's own lawyers actually stepped back from him, like he was suddenly radioactive, murmuring something about how his firm would need to reassess representation going forward. The mayor was already speaking quietly with 2 uniformed officers who'd been providing festival security, gesturing toward Derek's little group. Derek looked around at the crowd, at the faces of national reporters, at the mayor, at Verna Higgins, standing near the front with her arms crossed and an expression of pure, righteous satisfaction, at every single person who'd come out that evening to celebrate the very thing he'd tried to destroy, and I watched in real time the exact moment he understood there was no version of tonight where he walked away looking like anything other than exactly what he was. He didn't get arrested that night, not immediately. That would come 3 weeks later, when the tax fraud and forgery investigations that Priya's findings kicked off led to formal charges. But he left Hollow Creek Reserve that evening the way I once left that marble lobby, escorted, humiliated, and utterly, completely finished, while the entire crowd who'd gathered to celebrate my expansion instead witnessed his total public unraveling, live-streamed by at least 6 different phones and broadcast the following morning on 3 separate national news segments under headlines that used words like disgraced and exposed and, my personal favorite, the architect who built her empire and then dismantled his. That night, after the crowds had finally thinned and the string lights had dimmed to a soft golden glow over the empty barn, Nathaniel found me sitting alone on the porch steps of the farmhouse, the same steps where I'd sat with 1 suitcase and $1,100, plotting my entire future in the dark. "You didn't need me up there," he said, sitting down beside me. "No," I agreed, "but I'm glad you were there anyway." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the creek in the distance, before he finally asked the question I think he'd been holding all evening. "Are you happy? Really happy, Maggie? Not just successful, happy." I thought about it honestly before I answered, because he deserved an honest answer. I said slowly, "for the first time in 15 years, I don't feel like I'm performing my life for someone else's approval. I built this because I wanted it, not because I needed anyone to forgive me for wanting it." That feels like happiness. Maybe it is. It was almost a month later when Derek showed up one final time, alone this time, no lawyers, no suits, driving a car that looked considerably less impressive than the one he used to have. He'd lost his firm entirely by then. The fraud investigation had gutted whatever remained of Kingston and Associates, and word travels in professional circles just as fast as it does in small towns, maybe faster. He found me by the front office of Hollow Creek Reserve, and for a moment standing there in a wrinkled shirt with dark circles under his eyes, he looked exactly like what he'd always secretly been underneath all that polish. A small, frightened, hollow man who'd built his entire identity on taking credit for things he never earned. "Maggie," he said, and his voice actually cracked, "I need to talk to you. Please, I have nothing left. My name is destroyed in this industry, the way mine used to be. I was hoping, maybe a consulting position, something small, or even just a percentage, a tiny share of what you've built. I could help you expand. I still have contacts, I looked at him for a long moment. I want to tell you, listeners, that I felt something, anger maybe, or grim satisfaction, or even a flicker of old affection for the man I once thought I'd marry. But the truth is, I felt almost nothing at all. Just a calm, clear, quiet indifference. The kind you feel toward a stranger asking you for directions to a place you have absolutely no interest in visiting. "Derek," I said, "I don't know you." "Maggie, come on. We were together for 6 years, we were engaged, I don't know you," I repeated, evenly, without a trace of cruelty in my voice, because cruelty would have meant he still mattered enough to provoke it. "The man who built this place has never met you. He built himself from a suitcase and $1,100, with no help from anyone who ever tried to take credit for his work. I think you should leave now. And I'd genuinely prefer if you never came back to this town again." He stood there for a moment, waiting, I think, for me to soften, the way I always used to when he pushed just slightly against my boundaries. I didn't soften. I turned and walked back into my office, back into the life I had built entirely with my own 2 hands, and I never saw Derek Kingston again. I heard, through the same small-town grapevine that once mocked me on Main Street, that Derek eventually moved back in with his parents in the suburbs, took a mid-level drafting job at a firm that had no idea who he used to be, and stopped mentioning architecture awards altogether. I didn't feel joy hearing it. I didn't feel much of anything, honestly, which was its own kind of victory. The version of me who needed him to suffer for me to feel whole had stayed behind on that porch step 2 years earlier, replaced by a woman who simply didn't need his downfall to validate her own rise. Hollow Creek Reserve has 3 sister properties now, all across the county, all designed by me, all named on every single blueprint. Nathaniel and I run the business side by side, as true partners in every sense of the word. Verna Higgins works the front desk on weekends now, greeting guests with the same booming voice she once used to mock me on Main Street, except now she tells every single visitor the story of the woman who came home with 1 suitcase and turned it into a small empire. I let her tell it. It's a good story. It's my story. So here's my real question for you tonight, and I mean this one honestly. Have you ever found the strength to completely cut out toxic people from your life and watch karma do its job all on its own? Or did you feel the need to prove something to them first, the way I almost did, before I realized the best revenge isn't proving anything at all, it's simply becoming so happy, so whole, and so completely yourself that they become irrelevant? Comment below. I read every single one of your stories, and I mean that.